couple more announcements while you're turning to 1 Thessalonians chapter 2. I forgot to mention that Miss Doris on our prayer list has been moved to Genesis. So she's there now, so continue to pray for her. And for Clyde, be sure to pray for Clyde, as this is an adjustment for him. And the other one announcement, I had it up here and I didn't even say anything about it. Your new directories. There were a few errors in the old ones. Some things have changed. So we put out new ones this morning. They're on the table in the lobby and in the breezeway. So if you want to pick you up another one, toss your old one. You'll be up to date until tomorrow. So, okay. All right, let's see. 1 Thessalonians chapter 2. I actually want to back up one verse and kind of begin where we left off last week. In chapter 1, verse 10, and Paul finished that chapter by saying, "And to wait for his Son from heaven, whom he raised from the dead, that is Jesus, who rescues us from the wrath to come." Paul says we're waiting for Jesus. But while we're waiting, how many of you know to wait well? We want to wait well, but to wait well means to walk worthy. While we're waiting, to walk worthy. And that's what we're going to talk about in chapter 2. It's about walking worthy of our Lord while we're still here on earth. The title today is, of course, our series is Preparing Saints to Live Saintly. The title of our message today is In Defense of the Gospel, but not only the Gospel. Sometimes defense has to be made for the Gospel herald, for the one bringing the Gospel. And so today we're going to show how the two of them go together, not just defending the Gospel, but also defending the Gospel herald. Look at your takeaway in your bulletin today. It says it's on your first note page there. It says the integrity of the Gospel is somewhat dependent on the integrity of the Gospel herald. Now, obviously, I need to elaborate on that statement a little. Actually, the integrity of the Gospel stands alone. It stands strong. However, whether or not the Gospel is listened to sometimes depends on the character of the one bringing that message. The integrity of the one bringing the Gospel is we're going to see today. So last week we talked about the herald. We said the herald is one who loudly proclaims the gospel message to a lost and dying world. And we discovered that the gospel herald is not just the preacher who stands in a pulpit and does this, but it's also every born-again believer who has been saved by the message of the blood of Jesus. And so we're all heralds. We're all gospel heralds. But our world has placed some serious, undue skepticism on the heralds. And sometimes they have to be defended by truth. Now, obviously in our day, some in churches have brought it on themselves. We've seen lots of pastors just in recent months, in a year or two, that have fallen from positions, and people have put a lot of faith and trust in them and never thought they would. And so they bring some of this criticism on themselves, but a lot of the criticism that happens today is undue criticism, and so the gospel and the herald has to be defended by truth from time to time. So in chapter 2, that's what Paul's going to do. He abruptly changes the subject, though it's still about the Christian herald. Chapter 1 was all about the example that he and Silas and Timothy were to the Thessalonians of living like Jesus, and how they had followed those examples and lived them out before those in Macedonia and Achaia. And so all was working exactly like it was supposed to. And Paul was thrilled with this. He was thrilled with this new church that he had planted, the first church that he ever planted, that it was a thriving church, and it was thriving in such a beautiful way. But now he turns his message to a very personal note. He's going to talk a lot about himself today. Some about himself, Silas and Timothy, but mostly about himself. He really takes this very personally. And without mincing words, he's going to talk boldly as he proclaims to the Thessalonians there, the saints that are there, what it had actually cost him personally to bring the gospel to them about a year earlier. But before we get into all the details of this chapter, we have to ask why Paul felt the need to literally defend his character and defend his ministry at Thessalonica. Was it because he was thin-skinned and couldn't take insults very well? We're going to see, you already know as much as you've read about Paul through the years, that that's not the case at all. We have a greater record of the mistreatment of the Apostle Paul, the things that he endured in ministry, than any other apostles, probably all of them put together. We have an extensive record of things that he had to undergo unfairly. And so I remember years ago, before I ever went into ministry, I used to listen to lots of preachers, but one specifically, the first one I ever started listening to was a guy named Chuck Swindoll. Y'all probably heard of him, Dr. Chuck Swindoll. And I just still remember him saying back then, like I said, long before I went into ministry, that if you're going to go into ministry, especially pastoral ministry, you better have skin like an armadillo. I think Swindoll's from Texas, and he understood armadillos. Well, I want you to know something. Paul did. Paul had skin like an armadillo. He was tough skinned. But still, he feels the need to spend a half a chapter defending himself and his ministry at Thessalonica. And so we began the series last week by laying a foundation in Acts chapter 16 and 17. We read several verses from those. If you weren't here, you might want to go back and read those later today. But those two chapters is where Luke records many of the acts of hostility from the unbelieving Jews against Paul and the others, Silas and Timothy, from the time he got to Philippi until he moved into Thessalonica, and when he moved out of there into Berea, and on and on and on. And obviously these same enemies of Paul, even after he left, they could no longer literally beat him and flog him and jail him and all those things that they were doing. But after he left, they continued the abuse by accusing him of all kinds of untruths in hopes of discrediting Paul, therefore hindering his spread of the gospel. Remember, Paul was only in Thessalonica for 3 weekends. So they would have accused him of leaving town hurriedly because he was simply a self-seeking coward. That's ironic because this angry mob, as we've read, drives Paul out from the city with threats of violence if he stays any longer. And then after he escapes for his life, this same crowd tells the Thessalonians that if Paul really loved them, he would have stayed. That he was all really in it all for himself. You know anyone like that? The world's full of them. You need to look no further than Washington, D.C. You'll see a lot of people like that. That kind of hypocrisy. But it's important for us to understand that the Thessalonian Christians weren't the ones that were skeptical of Paul. Rather, it was the hate mongers outside the church. They were the ones that were spreading all these lies about Paul. Why were they doing that? Obviously, there were 2 reasons. One, they had a hatred of Paul. They had what we would call in our modern day a Paul derangement syndrome. They just didn't like this guy. And 2, because the church he founded had become very successful already. It was a vibrant church. It was growing. It was spreading the message that Paul originally brought. And that was offending these folks. And we'll see why in just a moment. And so not only did they not like Paul, but they didn't like his message. And so that's why they were trying to do all they could do to stifle his efforts. We'll see again what we learned last week in chapter 1, verse 8. You won't even have to turn back. I put it here on your bulletin. It says, "For the word of the Lord has sounded forth from you." Paul talking about the Thessalonians. "Not only in Macedonia and Achaia, but also in every place your faith toward God has gone forth, so that we have no need to say anything." Paul is just almost boasting about this church, how they did exactly what they were supposed to do. They took the gospel, they took it in, it meant something to them, and then they began to spread it to other people. And so they were having a real gospel impact, not only in Thessalonica, but in Achaia and beyond. And the enemy does what the enemy always does when God's people take God's calling seriously. They try to squash their effort, believing that discrediting the one of whom God chose to use to start this movement would be the best way, if they could discredit him, to halt this gospel movement that was getting underway really strong. And so Paul comes and he switches gears here in this second chapter, and he offers his defense, not because he's concerned about his own personal reputation, but because Paul knows this. He knows that if he, as the herald, is discredited, then the gospel itself would become discredited. And that's exactly what we learned in last week's message about living by example. Paul would say, "Follow me as I follow Christ." Meaning that our personal testimony is more important to the gospel than we might think it is. And Paul knows that, so he goes on the defense for all the right reasons. So Paul's going to combat each accusation by his words of defense. By the words that he uses, you can almost tell what the accusations were. But before we begin, I need you to understand the cultural setting in the Roman Empire where Thessalonica was located, because this is going to make it all make sense to you if you know this background. In the first century, there were many competing religions in and around Thessalonica, in this area, as well as many ministers of those religions. You might call them the evangelists of all of those competing religions. They weren't just religions that happened to be living together. They were literally competing with one another. And so the problem was most of them were motivated by greed, by the love of money. Thessalonica was located on what we know as the Via Egnatia. And that is simply a Roman trade route that stretched from the east to the west through Macedonia. Thessalonica was the largest city in Macedonia. Scholars believe that even in that day, the population was probably somewhere around 200,000 people. Now think about that. That's a large population for first century anywhere. But that's what we think we know, that how big this place was. The reason it was so big, so populated, such a busy place, is that it was an important port city. It had a large port there for the trading and all that went on. And so it was a melting pot city. It had cultures literally from all over the world, which when you bring those cultures from all over the world, they bring with them a variety of religions. And so there one could find the worship of, first of all, the 12 gods of the Olympian pantheon. Have you ever heard of that? From A to Z, everything from Apollo to Zeus and on beyond that. There were also various cults and shrines to foreign gods, some from Egypt and some from other places. And then, of course, there were the Jewish people. There were Jewish people that already had moved into Thessalonica in Macedonia. And then there were the God-fearing Gentiles. And then there were just simply lost people that didn't have any religious affiliation whatsoever. Of course, the ones that had a religious affiliation that weren't Christian, they're lost too, but they didn't know it. But then there were people that just didn't have an affiliation at all. And so this was a huge, what we need to see this as, it was a huge religious marketplace. This was a place where they literally marketed religions, where they sold their religions. And they had lots of missionaries of these religions that were competing for attention. You couldn't walk down the street without, these evangelists trying to convert you to their religion, because there was money involved in it. Many of them were simply opportunists, taking all they could get from their listeners. And then they'd just move on. They'd move in, they'd have a message, they would get some listeners following them, they'd take a big collection, and then they would leave town. And they would move to the next place, to a next group of targets. And so that's the way they operated. It was all about the money. That is the setting in which Paul chose to plant the very first church that he planted in Thessalonica, in this big, heavily populated port city right on a trade route. Talk about dropping right into the thick of it. That's what Paul did. But from this setting, you can see how easy it would have been for the enemies of Paul to try and paint him as just another shyster selling his religion for whatever price he could get. So with that background, you're going to see that in the language as we read and see what Paul's defending himself from. You'll be able to see what the accusations were, and you'll see that it's all about what I've just told you in this background. So let's jump into verse 1 of Thessalonians. I've been studying this, and sometimes I see the word Thessalonians, sometimes Thessalonica, sometimes Thessalonians, and I just kind of get mixed up with all these different ways to say this word, so if I do, just bear with me. But in verse 1 it says, "For you yourselves know, brethren, that our coming to you was not in vain." So Paul's starting out right away with this church. He's writing this letter. He's about a year away now, and he's writing back to them to say he's been hearing all of this. The message has been spreading that Paul's a shyster. Why he was there, he was just one more of them in the religious marketplace. And he's trying to say to them, here's what, you know this yourself, Thessalonican saints, or Thessalonian saints. You know that my coming to you wasn't in vain. He's speaking of his success in his missionary effort. It was apparent to everyone that Paul's ministry in Thessalonica had been a great success, not an empty thing like a salesman just blowing through town with a product to sell, but rather Paul's was a ministry of genuine sincerity, as evidenced by the planning of a very vibrant church that continued to grow a year later in a very powerful way. So Paul says what we did there was not in vain, and you yourselves know that because you're living it. He goes on in verse 2, "But after we had already suffered and been mistreated in Philippi," remember we read about that in chapter 16 and 17 of Acts last week. "As you know, we had the boldness in our God to speak to you the gospel of God amid much opposition." In other words, Paul's saying that he was willing to jump from the frying pan at Philippi right into the fire at Thessalonica. And so he said, we were bold to bring the gospel to you. Paul is coming to them literally with the bruises, probably the cuts, the stripes on his back, still open wounds. It hadn't even been long enough since he was jailed in Philippi and then came to Thessalonica that he had time to scab over. So they saw that. They saw the suffering that he had already done, and he suffered because he was over in Philippi spreading the gospel, yet he was bold enough to say, we're just going to keep doing this. We're going to go to another town and we're going to do it again. And so he's making the point, if he's just in this ministry thing for himself, he's not too smart. Because this is how you get beat up. This is how you get jailed and so forth. But he's not in it for himself. So he says, I was bold. Despite his enemies' false accusations, Paul didn't just preach the gospel when it was easy or when it was popular. He was bold enough to preach it even in the midst of a lot of conflict. And he found conflict in Thessalonica as well. Remember, they ran him out of there too. They didn't just run him out of there. He went to Berea and started having an effect there, and the people from Thessalonica chased him down there. It was about 50 miles away. They chased him down there and chased him out of Berea as well. So it was a lot of conflict that he's talking about here. Verse 3, for our exhortation does not come from error or impurity or by way of deceit. Of course, Paul's talking about all these other religions and what they're doing. They're full of error, they're full of impurity, and they're full of deceit. And Paul says, we didn't come to you that way. And so he didn't come flattering people like the salesman did. Rather, it was the purity of his message of truth that made it abundantly clear that there was no deceit in Paul's ministry. Remember, again, this is a religious marketplace where deception and opportunists abound. But Paul claimed to have approval from God Himself. So look at verse 4. But just as we have been approved by God to be entrusted with the gospel. Let me say that again. We have been approved by God to be entrusted with the gospel. So we speak not as pleasing men, but God who examines our hearts. Think about that just for a moment in a personal way. What must we do to be approved by God to be entrusted with the gospel? What is it that makes us trustworthy with the gospel and approved by God? Well, we go back to that threefold plan we discovered last week. Back over in the first chapter, in verses 4 through 6 and 8. You won't even have to turn there. I'll just tell you what happened in those three verses. First, the people of Thessalonica, they received the gospel when it came to them. Okay? And then they began to allow the gospel to work in them, to make changes in their lives and make them into new creatures. And then finally, they didn't just sit on that. Finally, they began to go out and let the gospel flow from them. So it came to them, worked in them, flowed from them as they were spreading the gospel to other places. That's what it looks like to be approved by God and entrusted with the gospel. It's about taking the whole gospel as it's meant to be in all of its facets. First it comes to us, we receive it. Then we let it begin to come alive in us. And then we share it with everyone that we can. And that's just for preachers though, right? No. No, it's for every Christian who has been saved by the gospel truth. Look again at the end of verse 4. So we speak not as pleasing men, but God who examines our hearts. I remember very clearly one day when God spoke into my heart, not audibly, but strong. Practically the day I entered into ministry, 19 years ago. It's like He spoke into my heart, and you remember one thing. Audience of one. Audience of one. What did that mean? It simply meant this, that you're not going into this thing to please men. You're going to say a lot of things from the pulpit, from the Word of God, that will be offensive. Jesus said, my gospel is offensive. You're going to say things that people won't agree with, that make people angry. You're not there to please men, to tickle ears. Audience of one, you're there to please me, God said. And so you take my word and you preach it just like it is. And you don't know how often, I've literally felt like I was the only one who got anything from a message I preached. But I believe the process of studying and preparing and sharing was still pleasing to God. And I believe that if I did my part, I'd just leave it up to God to take care of opening the hearts and minds. And God has taught me so much. Whether anybody else got anything or not, God has taught me so much in the process. And so I want you to notice what verse 5 says. For we never came with flattering speech, as you know. In other words, Paul probably offended some folks with truth. He says, you know this. We didn't do that, nor with a pretext for greed, and God is our witness. Paul says, I didn't tickle your ears so I could collect a big offering and then leave town. His goal was never to please men, but to help men by sharing the life-saving truth of God with them. I mean, you know, sometimes helping people is hurtful. I mean, it just kind of is. But we got to do that. I mean, we cannot compromise truth. And so we do that. Verse 6 and 7 says this, nor did we seek glory from men, either from you or others, even though as apostles of Christ we might have asserted our authority. But we proved to be gentle among you, as a nursing mother tenderly cares for her own children. Paul says here, we could have asserted our apostolic authority. We could have done that, but in contrast, we proved to be as gentle as a nursing mom. What do we know about on Father's Day? What do we know about moms and dads and little babies? Here's what we know. The love is one-sided. Yeah, you know what I'm talking about. Those little babies. It's one-sided. Mom and dad does all the loving, and the baby just does what he wants. But the mom and dad, they get up all through the night if the baby cries. A mom might nurse the baby. A dad might go prepare the bottle. They change that baby's diaper. They rock that baby to sleep. They make that baby as comfortable as possible, all while they sacrifice their own sleep. And how does the baby reward them? About the time they get back to sleep, that baby cries out and it all starts over again. And they get up and do it again. And that's the relationship that Paul is describing here. It's one where these three, he and Silas and Timothy, they gave themselves to the Thessalonians. Now obviously they gave themselves back, but they were going to do it even if they didn't. It was like being a nursing mother, giving herself to that baby, whether the baby appreciated it or not, or showed appreciation for it or not. And that's the way they approached the people there. And they took nothing for themselves. They didn't take anything from them. They just gave. And so Paul is appealing to them in the midst of all these false accusations that were being leveled against him, that they simply remember what they truly experienced when he was with them and what they saw for themselves. Not what they've heard, but what they saw for themselves. Verse 8 and 9, having so fond an affection for you, we were well pleased to impart to you not only the gospel of God, but also our own lives, because you had become very dear to us. For you recall, brethren, our labor and our hardship, how working night and day so as not to be a burden to any of you, we proclaimed to you the gospel of God. All right, first of all, what do we see here? In just 3 weekends with these people, we know that's all he stayed there. They had become so dear to Paul, Silas, and Timothy that they poured themselves into them, not only the gospel, but their own lives as well. They had made great personal sacrifices for them as they had endured beatings and imprisonment and threats of violence just to bring them the gospel. And then they labored day and night. What does that mean? That means they went out and they worked a secular job all throughout the day so they could bring them the gospel at night or some other time or vice versa. In other words, they were working to supply their own needs and then working to share the gospel. So they were doing double duty just to get that to them. And they took care of their own needs. So why did they do that? Well, maybe you remember from my message a few weeks ago about the preachers. How Paul is the one who wrote so strongly about the preachers in 1 Corinthians and in 1 Timothy about the church's responsibility to take care of the preachers, of the pastors. But here, Paul says, we didn't do that in your presence. We didn't put any burden on you. We didn't receive any care from you. Even though we could have exercised our apostolic authority and say, remember, you're supposed to pay for this and all, but he didn't. They didn't do that there. Why? Well, this is a brand new church plant, for one thing, and it's located in the midst of a marketplace of ministry deception, where ministry is being sold to the highest bidder, where religion is being used to take advantage of people. So Paul wanted to make sure that no one could accurately accuse him of being in this thing just for the money. Even though he's being accused of that, Paul says, you really can't accuse me of that because you guys know exactly what I did while I was there. Verse 10. You are witnesses, and so is God, how devoutly and uprightly and blamelessly we behave toward you believers. Paul could very confidently say to those reading his letter in Thessalonica, you know, and so does God. God knows it too. You both know how hard we worked so as not to be a burden on you, because you were an upstart church. And we, along with you, just wanted to see this new church take off and succeed. But notice the words that Paul uses specifically to describe his and Silas's and Timothy's behavior before these new believers while he was with him. He uses these words, devoutly and uprightly and blamelessly. Paul just set a bar really high for all of us, didn't he? When he uses words like that, he's describing proper Christian behavior, what testimonies ought to look like. And they're at a so much higher standard than the world around us. So high that it makes people notice something different about these people called Christians. Something different about the message they're bringing. Something maybe I ought to at least give ear to. That's what Paul is saying. We should live in such a way, so high above the norm, that we're noticed for the right reasons. And the right reason is to give us an opportunity to speak into the hearts of other people with the truth of the gospel. These are three words that we need to consider when we think about how we act before an unsaved world. Is this our testimony? It was for Paul and Silas and Timothy as they saw unbelievers become believers. Possibly partly due to them being able to see men walking the walk along with talking the talk. And so Paul goes on in 11 and 12. And just as you know how we were exhorting and encouraging and imploring each of you as a father would his own children, so that you would walk in a manner worthy of the God who calls you into His own kingdom and glory. You know what stood out to me as I studied this passage? That unlike a lot of Christianity today, Paul's diligent interest in lost people was not just to see them saved, but to see them saved and walking in a manner that's worthy of God. That's why I titled this, that and other reasons in this book, why I titled this series, Preparing Saints to Live Saintly. Because that's what Paul is saying that God is expecting of us, not just to get saved, but to live like saved people. Saints living saintly. And so he says to walk in a manner worthy of God. How do we do that? How do we walk in a manner that's worthy of God? Well, it's hard and it's simple. It'd be hard for us to do in the flesh. First of all, we got to be saved. We got to be Holy Spirit filled. Okay, you can't. In other words, we're never going to be worthy on our own. We have been made worthy through Jesus. All right, but how do we actually walk worthy? Well, we walk with Jesus, and we walk like Jesus, and that makes us walk worthy. When we're walking with Jesus and we're walking like Jesus, whatever He would do, we would do, then we're walking worthy, and that's what he's talking about here. Second thing he's talking about, that Paul says that he sees them have such a godly impact on lost people. That the lost people are willing to listen to a message that produced such a positive change in the messenger. You know what I'm saying? Paul says that when we're walking worthy and we're having an impact on people, that is what makes people ready to listen to what we say. I remember one of my churches, we had a young woman, and she had grown up in the church, and she had fallen away. And she had gotten into some pretty rough stuff, and everybody in the community knew about it. And she lived that lifestyle for about a year. And one day God got a hold of her, and she decided to make a comeback and begin to clean up her act and all that. But she got real enthusiastic about it, about this new spiritual walk. And she began to go around and tell everybody how you ought to live. You ought to live like I'm living because I'm getting it right now. And she came to me one day frustrated. And I sat down on a pew there beside her, and she said, "What do I need to do?" And I said, "You need to shut up." I didn't say it quite that boldly, but I told her she needed to stop talking. And I said, "Look, you've got a reputation now that says something different than you're walking with God. And everybody knows about that reputation. And what you need to do is walk with God for a while. You need to build a new reputation. You need to let people see that this lady truly is. A change is happening. She's walking with God. And after a season of people seeing that, then you begin to use words. But nobody's listening to you right now because they're just remembering the reputation. You need to live it out first if you've come out of that lifestyle before you talk about it. And so that's what Paul's saying here, is that they had such an impact on lost people because they themselves had produced change in their lives. And now people were willing to listen to them. So notice that Paul's diligence in the words he uses in verse 11. He says, we were exhorting and encouraging and imploring each one of you as a father would to his own children. The word there, exhorting, simply means we were urging you. And then the word encouraging means, it almost sounds like the same thing. Encouraging someone to do something would be urging them. But you know what the encouraging word, it means we're supporting you. We support what you do. And then the third one is imploring you. That just simply means to beg. We were begging you. Begging you to come to Christ and experience Him and then begin to walk with Christ and like Christ. And he's saying, as a father would do this for his own child, someone he loves so dearly, more than anybody else, that he's trying to teach and exhort, encourage. We did it to you like you were our own children. And they obviously caught on. Look on your bulletin. This is again from last week. where Paul said about them, he said, just as you know what kind of men we proved to be among you for your sake. We lived this way and you benefited from it. And then here's what happened to you. You also became imitators of us and of the Lord. That can only happen if they were walking like the Lord. You can't imitate Paul and Jesus unless Paul's walking with Jesus. Okay? And like Jesus. Having received the word in much tribulation with the joy of the Holy Spirit, so that you became an example to all the believers in Macedonia and in Achaia. In other words, Paul says, and you caught it from us, and you started spreading it to other people the same way. Again, this is to be the common result of true Christianity. But though it's sadly uncommon today, but it doesn't have to be. It's up to you and me personally. Whether this is our common way, we receive it, we live in it, we act like it, and we spread the word not only by words, but by the way we live our lives. Isn't it amazing that Paul just didn't say, look, here's what you need to do, church. Just follow Jesus. He could have said that. That would have been a good thing to say. But he didn't. He lived in such a way that he could say, follow me as I follow Jesus. I look at that and I say, wow. What a heavy responsibility to carry. But Paul says that's what we're to be about. And here's why. And you know this. You've heard enough people talk about God and, I just wish I could see Him and all this, but, He's invisible. Sometimes people just need to see the visible. They need to see it in front of their eyes, but God is invisible. But man isn't. You know what I mean by that? I believe God knows what I mean. He calls us to be the visible examples of Him for others to see. And Paul was comfortable with other Christians following his example. He's saying, you want to see Jesus, just look at me. But you can't say that unless you're walking like Jesus. You shouldn't. But Paul was living the life so closely that he could say, I know you need to see something visible. I'm that person. As I follow Jesus, I'm going to show you what Jesus looks like in my life. And then I'm going to tell you all that Jesus told us to tell you. And so that's a worthy goal for every Christian today. What Paul was doing in Thessalonica was simply preparing saints to live saintly. That should be our goal. I mean, if you were a professional ball player, what's the expectation? You're going to play ball as well as you possibly can. You're going to look like a professional ball player, right? If you're a nuclear physicist, well, I can't even speak to that. I don't even know what you're supposed to do, but just something pretty special that everybody can't do. But you know what I mean? When we claim the name of Christ, we need to be diligent about making sure we're living our life like Christ. For Christ, like Christ. Because the world can't see Jesus. So they look to the Christ follower. That's a heavy responsibility, but it's ours. Let's pray. Our Heavenly Father, Lord, thank you for teaching us your word, for speaking into our heart, for doing yourself what you've told us to do, and that is not to speak to please men, but to please you. You've not given us an easy way. It's not that you're tickling our ears with your messages. It's that you are diving deep into our heart with a lot of conviction. But it's conviction that we need, Lord. And thank you for it. Lord, now what we need is for you to come alongside us moment by moment, day by day, with your dear Holy Spirit. Fill us and control us and help us to yield to your control so that we are walking with Jesus and like Jesus for a world that needs a visible example of what he looks like. Help us to be that example. In Jesus' name, amen. Start enjoying your Father's Day. Here's two things I want you to see happen today. I want you fathers to have a great day, and I want the rest of you to make sure that they do. Okay? Okay? I don't know, Dads. I don't know how this is going to go. Not a lot of enthusiasm here. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.